Thank you for joining us. I know that the Jugler group here was very excited to have you visit, and we're honored to have your presence. So thanks for making the trip.
It's great to be here.
So we started this conversation with the notion that ancient texts can teach us something, but here you are at Google, where we operate mostly in ones and zeros, and we talk about things like artificial intelligence on a regular basis. Tell us a little bit more about how you came to this idea that the ancient texts can help us in this modern world.
Great. So to become a rabbi, I spent about 6 years in a room. It's a room about half the size of this room, and it's called the Beit Midrash. And Beit Midrash means the house of searching. And there are Beit Midrashes all over the world, and they're filled with books, lined with books, like a library. But unlike a library, they're very loud. You walk in the Beit Midrash, and there's this roar of speech and hand motions and gesticulating and people standing up and sitting down and pacing around and not studying in a quiet, focused way, but arguing and debating and conversing. And they're primarily studying the Talmud. The Talmud is not really a book, it's more of a conversation, thousands of years old, still running today. And rabbis, people like me who go to yeshiva, to go to a Beit Midrash, to study and to search, we spend a lot of hours studying this book. And so I put in literally thousands of hours into studying the Talmud. And it's a curious collection. It's associative, it's narrative, it's law, all jumbled, mixed up together. It's not organized, systemic thought. It's conversations and arguments and disputations spanning generations. In fact, maybe we can even put an image of a page of the Talmud on the screen. The Talmud is a book that was composed in multiple stages. So this is the layout. If you look in the middle, you have a text from what's called the Mishnah. That comes from around 200 CE in Israel. Then following that, in that middle block, you have some text which we call the Gemara. That's from 500 CE Babylonia. Then on the right, you have people commenting on that middle text, a man named Rashi, who was 11th century France. And then on the left, you have Rashi's grandchildren called Tosafot, and they're arguing on what Rashi says, saying, no, you got it wrong, it's really like this. And then on the sides, you have commentators from Germany and Poland in the 14th and 15th and 16th centuries. And that's all just on one page. So you enter this page, and you're entering into a conversation which is spanning continents and centuries and millennia, and is still active today. And we're still trying to figure out and arguing with the commentators and arguing with one another and trying to get to the truth of what this text really means. And as I started to learn it and spent more time really getting into its world, I realized that there are ancient ideas about agriculture and about animals and about torts that may seem like from another world, but actually the way that the Talmud is structured and the way that the learning and the debate flows might have a lot to offer to our world today. And I started to try to mine the Talmud for some of these insights that we might be able to apply to our world. And so I'll maybe share a couple of those things which I emerged from my years of study. And at any point, jump in, because that's the classic Talmudic style, to jump in and challenge or question or disagree. One thing that I love about the Talmud is that it's all about questions. It begins with a question. It's thousands of pages of questions, questions on the text, questions of one another, questions on a question. There's a classic joke that there's a boy who goes to learn the Beit Midrash, for school, and he comes home, and instead of the mother asking the child, did you, do well in school today? Did you do well on the test? Did you give a good answer? The mother says, did you ask a good question today? Did you ask a good question? That's the key. The good question is the best thing you can do in Talmud study. And I think that's a great way to learn, to start with questions, to follow questions wherever they take you, even sometimes to very absurd or strange ends. And this teaches you to not just accept inherited wisdom, and I think this is very much in the spirit of Google, but to always question and turn and ask, can we do it better? Is there another way of thinking about this? Is there another perspective that we're missing? To always look for that next question. Sometimes the questions in the Talmud are not even answered. There'll be a question, they'll debate it for pages and pages, and at the end they'll say, we don't know, move on to the next question. And I love that. You can just dwell in the uncertainty and say, we don't have an answer, and that's okay. So that's one thing that I really took away from the Talmud, is the importance and the essence of learning as an act of questioning. I also love in the Talmud, it's a plurality of voices. When you approach a Talmudic text, you're hearing, as I mentioned, voices that span generations, that span continents. Within the Talmudic text itself, it's multiple opinions on a given topic. Sometimes they will decide this one's right, but they'll preserve the one who was wrong. They'll preserve the minority opinion, the opinion that wasn't accepted in the end, to show that, you know what, we went with this opinion, but we still hold this other opinion. We're going to keep it, codify it, write it down, so that everyone can see the plurality of opinions and ideas about this particular topic that we're discussing. So that's another takeaway. And the final piece that I really think has a lot to offer, just in terms of an approach to study, an approach to learning, approach to knowledge, is that everybody gets to be a part of the conversation. The Talmud, as we showed, spans so many generations, and it's still ongoing. We say the Talmud is actually an oral text. It's the oral Torah. We have a Torah that's written down. That's what we call the Bible, the Torah. It's written. And then the oral Torah of the Talmud is really a conversation that continues to flow and be written today. And commentaries are constantly being added. The Talmud is a canon that's gloss after gloss, commentary after commentary are still growing and will continue to grow forever and ever. So the conversation never ceases. And everybody can bring their own voice and their own perspective, and that's what we're supposed to do when we study the Talmud. So those are three in terms of the methodology and the structure of the text that I think have a lot to offer the world today.
Well, those are all really critical, asking the right questions, having a plurality of views, and making sure everyone's part of the conversation. We talk about that a lot in our company. Of course, you might call us the original House of Searching, but now we know that there was something before. When you showed the Talmud, I was also struck by the notion of contributing on other ideas and showing the conversation is really something we've taken into the digital sphere with something like Twitter, where that's exactly what's happening, and I'm pretty sure they're not answering all the questions there as well. How do you, as you study that, how do you reconcile that some of these questions don't have answers, and what advice would you give us as we struggle with the questions that are being debated every day in our world, you know, immigration, otherness, this idea of how you build community in a world that is so connected and disconnected from each other. Is there anything you have read or studied that you could impart to us to help us think about that differently?
Well, one of the things that I loved about studying the Talmud is that it doesn't shy away from the hard questions. Even the rabbis of the Talmud themselves, when they're commentating on the Bible, the Torah, it seems like they were coming across some things that really inspired them, and they wanted to really highlight and accentuate in terms of moral values. For example, the Talmud reads back into the Bible, and it reads 36 times the Torah saying you have to love the stranger. Now, if you went through the Torah itself, you might not find 36 times that it says you have to love the stranger, but the rabbis were so adamant about that value, they were willing to dig and search and find any hint of the value of loving the stranger. And the stranger in the Torah is the foreigner, is the migrant, is the immigrant, is the person who's coming into a space, who's vulnerable, who's other, who needs to be protected. So they are willing to go back and work to try to unearth those values that may be latent in a text or maybe a little bit below the surface. They're also willing to confront sometimes challenging things. As many people know, the Torah says, the Bible says, eye for an eye, arm for an arm, right? If you injure somebody, you do the same thing back to them. That's an interesting method of justice, right? If you say that every wound should be repaid by the same wound being done back to the person, well, an eye for an eye makes the whole world go blind, right? It's not necessarily a productive method of justice. And the rabbis of the Talmud struggled with that. They said, is that really the ideal form of justice? It's our inherited tradition. It's so sacred and holy to us. But is that really what the Torah meant? Did the Torah really mean to create a world where everybody's going to go blind? So they do the work, not abandoning the sacred text, but rather reading it and rereading it and interpreting it and working with it until they came out with a whole new system that's basically torts, that if you injure somebody, you have to pay them, you compensate them for the time that they lost from work and for the pain that they suffered and from damages to their body, and 5 categories of damages. So that's an example where they're willing to look at a hard question and look at something which doesn't jibe with their sense of morality, perhaps, and struggle with the original text, not sever themselves from the past, not sever themselves from the inherited tradition, but find a new voice and a new way of expressing it that maybe even counter to the original intent, but is in line and progressive and moving in the way that they think the law needs to go. So I'm not sure if that directly answers your question, but I think there's something about being loyal to our inherited wisdom and tradition, reading it charitably, working with it, and helping it move along and progress and grow.
Well, that's interesting, and I think it does apply to many things that we struggle with here at Google. We are constantly thinking of ourselves as disruptors, so we want to come in and say, let's ignore what's happening, what the common wisdom is or the tradition in this industry, and let's shake it up. And sometimes in doing that, we end up destroying something really valuable or creating new problems, and we've seen that happen. So we are wrestling with that in our own way. One thing that strikes me about what you said, there's some who might say, oh, look, the ancient way of doing things can't possibly apply to us. We have so much better technology. We're so much more advanced. Civilization has come so far. And what do you say to those people who would argue, we've got to stop looking back and really focus on the new problems, the things that we've created here, and use new solutions like technology?
Yeah. It's a great question. I think about that a lot. Here I am bringing my 2,000-year Talmudic text. Oh, this is important. Listen to this, dealing with whatever issue we're dealing with. But what you find when you study the Talmud, or probably a lot of ancient texts, but specifically, in my experience, the Talmud, is that a lot of the problems that we're dealing with today aren't that new. That the things that we think are so, cutting edge and we've never seen this before and we've got to figure it out, they were struggling with 2,000 years ago as well. Maybe in a different context and the form is a little different, but they were thinking about it and dealing with it. And then, because it's a 2,000-year conversation, there's 2,000 years of debate and questions and answers and bad answers and good answers and wisdom that emerge from that conversation. So for example, the Talmud has a lot to say about privacy. And actually, maybe we'll take a look at that in a few moments. But privacy was something which really concerned the authors of the Talmud. And what are someone's rights to privacy? And is being seen a form of harm? So that's something which is a very ancient conversation, which has been debated and discussed. And I think we have what to learn from. Issues, very cutting edge issues like sexuality. The Talmud has 6 or maybe even 8 different conceptions of sexual identity, of sexual being. In terms of gender, right? So there are different categories there's a much broader palette of what gender and sexual identity is than male and female in the Talmud. That's really interesting. They were thinking about this 2,000 years ago. What could we draw from there and learn and bring into our world today? Questions about the nature of truth. We think we're in the postmodern era, post-truth, fake news, whatever we're dealing with now. This was also something which really preoccupied the rabbis of the Talmud because they were dealing in a world where there were multiple opinions about things. And how do we live in a society where we have people with very different ideas about what's true and what's essential? How do we construct communities where we can both debate those things but also hold the differences and keep it together? We have very different ideas about what's true and what's essential.
Well, on the one hand, I'm encouraged that these questions have been discussed before and there's wisdom. On the other hand, I'm wondering, 2,000 years they've been talking about this, how are we ever going to figure it out? So tell us more about how you would suggest we use it, this knowledge that we all don't have 5 years or longer to study in the way that you've had the opportunity to do. How can we, in our everyday lives, learn from this and pull it forward into what we're doing?
Yeah, so I think one of the best ways, I wouldn't recommend that everybody go spend 5 years learning Talmud. I mean, if you can, it's great. There's nothing like it, but it's not for everybody. But there's one particular thing I wanted to share today, which is something called chavruta. And this isn't so much of an idea, but more of a practice that's essential to the study of Talmud that I think can really be useful in many different spheres. Chavruta comes from the word chaver, which means friend. And there's a story in the Talmud about a great rabbi who was very, very wise, and he fell asleep, and he fell asleep for 70 years. It's kind of a Rip Van Winkle story. And he fell asleep, and 70 years later he wakes up, and he goes to the Beit Midrash, to the house of study, and he sees that everyone is quoting his wisdom, and he feels very good about himself. And they're quoting this guy, his name is Choni, and they say, Choni said this, and Choni said this, and he's like, wow, I really had a great impact. And then he walks in and he says, I'm Choni. I was asleep for 70 years. And nobody believes him. And all of a sudden, he's in the house of study, but he's totally alone. And he says this line, he says, O chavruta, O mituta, either friendship or death. And he dies. And that's the end of the story. And that strange story, powerful story, but what I think a key takeaway is the power of chavruta, of friendship, and the social nature of learning. So I mentioned walking into a Beit Midrash and it's loud and it's buzzing. That's because you might have, in my Beit Midrash, there's 50 people. There's a Beit Midrash that has thousands of people in one big room. Everybody's sitting like we're sitting right now, face to face. You have a text. We each have the same text in front of us, and we read the text. You read a line, I ask a question about it. You say what you think, I say what I think. I read a line, you ask a question, I say what I think. We go back and forth. Sometimes we agree, sometimes we disagree, sometimes we yell at each other and get really into it in a loving and friendly way. It's a lot of fun, and it's a great, great way to learn. I think in our era today of so much atomization and so much individualness in every sphere of our lives, the idea that you have a regular person who you sit for hours face to face with and study and talk and question, sometimes the most mundane matters, sometimes the most deep and important matters of life, mediated through the text, is such an important idea, I think, for all of us we can benefit from. It might be a chavruta studying the Talmud. It might be a chavruta studying a piece of code that we're working on or coding in pairs. It might be a chavruta in running or doing some activity together. But the idea is that we come together over this shared thing. We encounter the thing and we encounter one another and we're transformed. And that's such a key part of what Talmud study is all about. And I thought maybe we could even try a little chavruta study ourselves today, if you're up for it.
Oh, I didn't know this was going to be participatory, but I'm up for it.
Awesome.
Let's do this. Let's open it up for questions, and
Great.
then we'll pivot to more participation. We'll take questions from the dory, and then there's a microphone in the audience if anyone has any questions. I have one more question while we wait for Adam.
Great.
So I was thinking as you were talking about Havruta that we do try to do this here at Google. There's some pair coding, there's training where we sit in pairs and we share our pitches to clients and give each other feedback. Where we sometimes get friction is how do you have that conversation and when you disagree in a way that feels positive to both people? And what kind of guidelines do you set around that? How does the Havruta work in that way?
Yeah. It's a great question. I once, in one Beit Midrash that I studied in, there was a quote, all is fair in love and chavruta. Because it can get really intense. And when, especially on matters that really, are deep and core to whether it's your spiritual identity or an idea that you care passionately about or a project you're working on, of course, things get heated. So I think in a chavruta, you have to go into it knowing that this might not just be a very calm, nice atmosphere all the time. It may be heated and intense. I think going into that knowing that is good. I think setting some boundaries is important. When you have a chavruta, I would always do this with my chavrutas. Let's make sure that while we may passionately disagree on an idea, we'll never, attack each other personally. We'll never, we're gonna at the end of the session, we're gonna give each other a hug and make sure we can move on to our lives, in peace with one another. So setting boundaries for the chavruta, I think, is very important. Developing trust. Chavrutas take some time to mature. I think it's great to do paired learning, a one-off, I give a pitch, you give a pitch. But in chavrutas, there are chavrutas that last for 50, 60 years. People sit together, and maybe it's every day, maybe it's once a week, maybe it's once a month, but they are just that consistent deepening of the relationship. A good chavruta takes at least a couple months to really take hold. So it's developing that long-term relationship and trust and boundaries and guidelines to the conversation that then I think allow for the intense, animated, real conversations to take place.
Yeah, that's a great point. It takes a lot of time to build trust. It's not something you have on day one. We're only 20 years old as a company, so 50 years sounds like a long time to have one Havruta, sorry. I said it wrong. I'm working on it. Adam, you had a question.
Oh, thank you. Great. Thank you very much for being here. You earlier were saying this is a 2,000-year-old text, and there's all these lessons that you could learn from it. We also know 2019, living in the modern world, a lot of science, society, changes in the workplace, in the modern world. Are there ever examples where there are issues that you can't reconcile, or there are things where you wish the text would evolve faster than you'd like it to, or you see society moving in a way and you can't reconcile something that's black and white to you in the text, but yet you have this modern world you live in? How do you balance and grapple with those potential conflicts, if there even are conflicts?
Yeah, there can be. And that's part of my job, I think, as a rabbi, is to try to do that very grappling. There's a quote that I love from a Rabbi Cook, and he says, "The old will become new, and the new shall become sacred." And I think about that a lot. We have to take, my job as a rabbi is to revere and uplift and hold dearly to what's old. I know there's so many forces in the world that want to get us to move past and move to the next thing. And my job is to say, no, I'm not going to give it up, but I'm also going to figure out how does it speak to what's happening today? And how can we read it and reread it and turn it and understand it and to give this wisdom that we might offer today? And also, what does it have to offer to the world today? When we're moving so fast, sometimes we let go of a lot of things. We might throw the baby out with the bathwater. And yeah, there may be a concept about gender or about some social issue that you might read it at first glance at the Talmud and it feels kind of backwards or wow, that doesn't really resonate with me. But if we just throw it all away because of what one person said in their context 2,000 years ago, we might lose a lot of wisdom that's in it as well. And sometimes it's very surprising. Sometimes the things that I think are challenging, when I really look at them, actually are much more insightful. Here's a great example. There's a Talmudic text that talks about two towns, and a town near and a town that's far, and there's one well, and the well is close to town A, and town B is farther down the road. And the text says, well, what if there's not a lot of water to go around? And what if there's only enough water for one of the towns? So the answer is, so if there's only enough for one town, the town close to the well gets the water. Okay, that kind of makes a certain amount of sense. Then it says, well, what if there's enough water for the town and enough water for the people in the other town, but not enough water for the animals in the first town? So enough water for all the people, but not enough for the animals. Should the animals of the first town get the water, or should we share the water with the town that's far away? The Talmud says you got to share the water, right? People save the people's lives. The animals might die. That's sad, but share the water. And then it says, well, what if there's enough for this is very Talmudic. What if there's enough for the first town, animals and people, and second town, animals and people, but enough only for the laundry in the first town, but the second town is not going to get water for their laundry. So you say, okay, people, animals, laundry, first town, second town doesn't get laundry. And then there's one opinion at the very end of all this that says, even if there's not enough water for the people in the second town, the first town can still do their laundry. So get what it's saying there? Basically, let the other town die so you can wash your clothes. Now, the first time I encountered that, I was like, oh my gosh, that's terrible. Like, how unjust. But then if you think about the world that we live in today, I mean, how many towns are there where there isn't enough water, right? Each and every one of us could go right now and write, a check for whatever's in our bank account and send it to somewhere in the world that would go for water or some kind of life-saving necessity for a village, mosquito nets, right? There are not enough mosquito nets in the world. Every year, millions of people die from malaria. We could all give all our money away to buying people mosquito nets and not do our laundry, right? We could send all our laundry money, sell our washing machines, and live in stinky clothes so people would survive. But we don't, right? And that text forced me to really think about that reality. Here, the Talmud is saying, one rabbi in the Talmud is saying, let the other town die so you can do your laundry. I'm saying that's terrible. But then I'm thinking, wait a minute. Am I following that logic? Am I acting like that rabbi? So even the texts that are morally difficult often help me think about my own position and help me clarify and develop my moral sense even more.
Hi, thanks again to Echo for coming today. I think this talk is fascinating. I'm on the healthcare team at Google Cloud, and I was just wondering if you could comment in general, based upon your experience in your readings, how some of these concepts and the dialogue contribute to personal wellness.
It's a great question. So in the chavruta relationship, you're always heard, right? Because you're always sitting with somebody and you're always sharing your ideas and being listened to and then being fed back. So there's that just one-on-one encounter with another human being. In my religious belief, you're encountering the image of God all the time. And you're seeing that in someone and someone's seeing that in you. So in terms of wellness, I think that's one of the most important, as a rabbi, I see this a lot. I see people who are isolated, who aren't interacting with people as people. And I think that's huge. Just to have a place where you sit face to face with someone and encounter them. I think there's tremendous wellness that comes from that. And community. Talmud it's a communal text. It's a conversation. And again, in the world today where there are so many people who are isolated and there's so much atomization, just the idea that learning happens as a collective and argument is okay and dissension is okay and we can hold that together and we check in on one another and we're still friends and part of the same community even if we wildly disagree on the meaning of a text or on a really important core belief. We're still in this together. We're still a community. I think that also is a piece of wellness that I think we could all really benefit from in the world today. So I think encounter with another person and being a part of community are Talmudic wellness things. And there's a lot more. There's a lot of interesting ideas about health and some of them I think are interesting. Some are just bad science from 2,000 years ago. But there's a whole stream of people that are looking in the Talmud for ideas about healing and health. But I'm not a medical expert, so I won't comment on those.
It's a great point about wellness. I mean, we see the disrepair in the world as people aren't able to hold other opinions that aren't like theirs or other points of view, and the antagonism and acrimony that results from that. So that's a great lesson for us to learn. So I think if everyone here is up for it, we're going to pivot to something more participatory. So give us a quick overview of what you've brought.
Okay. Do we have are the sheets available? Great. Actually, we don't have one, though.
No, we don't.
Can somebody bring us one?
But I see one coming our way.
Thank you.
So this is no longer a talk at, this is a participate with.
Yes.
And we have this text in front of us. So tell us what we're going to do.
Okay. So there's a sheet here. There's two sides. And the first one says Chavruta Learning number 1. And this is a selection from the Talmud. It comes from a section that's all about civil law. The Talmud deals a lot with civil law. My ox, runs over your fence. Who's liable? My ox got hurt, your fence is damaged, what do we do? So this is about damages that can be done to another person, right? So there's a lot of discussion in the Talmud about damages, like, again, if you cut off my arm, what do you have to pay to me? How are you held liable? Torts, things like that. This one is dealing with a question about hezek re'iyah, which means damage by seeing. And the question is, if you see me in a private space, in a semi-private space, does that cause me damage? Just the act of being seen, can that constitute damage? So that's the debate that the rabbis of the Talmud are going to have right here. And it begins in the Talmud, that first source Babylonian Talmud, and then it's going to continue with commentaries. So we're going to go through time and space. We're going to start in 500 CE Persia, Babylonia. Then we're going to go to 1000 France, Barcelona 1200, Maimonides, Cordoba in Egypt. So we're going to kind of jump around the globe and see what these different commentators had to say about these, I think, questions which are probably very relevant to the work that Google is doing right now. And thinking about privacy, and thinking about the rights of individuals, and thinking about where do we draw the boundaries of privacy? Where should someone have absolute privacy? Where should they have some degree of privacy? That's what the Talmud and its commentators are discussing here. And that's the conversation which we're now going to continue. So this is a conversation that began some 2,000 years ago, and we're going to continue it here in 2019 in Google in Chicago. So we'll study it. We'll turn off maybe the vocal mics so you won't have to hear us studying it. But the goal is you're going to have a chavruta. So find someone that you don't know ideally, or you do know, either way, and sit face to face. Read the text to each other. It should be loud. We're going to turn this into a Beit Midrash, a house of study. There should be cacophonous noise of reading and questioning and gesticulating. It's a classic Beit Midrash move where you move your thumb. So you can practice that and do that. Well, I think it's like this, right? So you can
like this.
Physically, get your body into it. And we'll do that for a few minutes and we'll see how it goes.
We're going to wrap up your Havruta. Did I say it right this time?
Perfect.
Okay, getting there. Would love to get some feedback from the group. I will share for me, that was incredibly enlightening to understand that these questions that are so salient to us today, privacy, sexuality, difference, are being dealt with thousands of years ago. And they're having the same conversations in different ways, and maybe there's wisdom that we can learn from and understand that this is a condition of our humanity, and it's also something that we're not in alone. I mean, these are hard questions. Sometimes I wonder, why do we get to answer them? So what was your experience working in this paired learning setting?
We found that we had a lot of similar beliefs and that we had really real examples to share in terms of this. I think one that I spoke to in a work sense is that I work on the healthcare vertical as well in LCS. And if you think of Google search, it is the most private environment. And if somebody's looking up a condition or a symptom that
Yeah.
they're feeling, we don't allow our advertisers to remarket them or give a message based on that search. But it does happen across the internet, and it made me think of how private or how invasive that would feel if I had looked up something around, say, depression, and then received a follow-up message on that. And so I really appreciate that Google has created an environment where we respect that.
Yeah.
But the rest of the internet, I don't think follows those rules
Yeah.
at all. So that was one that
I recently was reading an article about someone who had a pregnancy loss, and she was writing about how for the next years, literally, she was getting targeted ads based on where the baby would be, right? So she lost the baby at 2 months, and then at 6 months she was getting ads for diapers, and then baby clothes, and then up to 4 years old, she was still getting your baby. Someone knew that she should have a child at that age, and just the damage that was. Someone saw that deeply, painful part of her, and not intentionally, but was doing tremendous emotional damage to this person.
It makes sense. And that goes to speaking to if it's in a private space, you expect that it can be very hurtful if you're seen in your own private space.
Right.
Interesting. Anyone else want to share their experience? Has anyone done this before?
No.
No, I have not. I haven't either. Have you, Adam? Okay, you've done it. In the back.
I thought it was a lot of fun. Towards the end of the conversation, we started to think about this question of like if you've heard of herd immunity around vaccination, it's something about like herd privacy. Like, because I was, to your point about like having a response and then realizing like, oh wait, I actually do that thing. Because I was talking about, I have a new niece and we're deeply obsessed with her. And we're posting pictures of her constantly. And what we had been talking about before was like, well, you should be able to opt in and give consent. And if you can't give consent, then it's wrong. But if you do give consent, it's fine. But then I was thinking about, it's like my 3-year-old niece can't give consent for her image to be all over the internet. And we don't know the consequences of growing up with your childhood on blast. Like, we don't know what that's like. It's never happened before. And so, like, philosophically, I'm opposed to that. And yet, like, I can't help myself. And I'm like, well, I guess I can. But this idea that, like, privacy only actually exists in the ecosystem if we are beholden to this standard of I don't have the right to share somebody else's information, and like what are all the ripple effects of that if you think about even like someone's image on Facebook, or there's probably a million ways to think about that, someone's email address. So I don't know, that was like a question around privacy that I definitely don't have the answer to, but it's like something we have to answer to some degree with search, but also like our phone numbers, our email addresses, all those things that hackers can take advantage of. So,
yeah. And I think to that point of opting in and making choices, I love the last text from Rambam, from Moses ben Maimon. It's a little obtuse, but what he's talking about is if you built your home in somebody else's line of sight. Right? So somebody else had a house and they had a window and they were looking out on a field, and you came and built your home in that field. You can't say to that person, close up your window. Stop looking at me, because you opted in, so to speak. You put yourself there. And so I think there's we talk about privacy and we talk about what companies should do and what Google should do and what the government should do, but there's also the piece of what should we be doing? Like, how should we be constructing our lives that we are protecting our own privacy and the privacy of others? And some of it is not in our hands. We rely on Google to take care of it for us, but some of it is in our hands and we make choices, and it's incumbent upon each of us to be thinking about those ways and to make responsible choices and not to blame it on the guy with the window that happens to look on the place where I build my house right in front of his window. It's not his fault.
That's fascinating. We will have you testify to Congress about that. Personal responsibility. Agreed. We all have a part to play in the conversation. That is what's really clear here, that there's the question of, if you want the wall, can you build it? Who can see you? Do you build where someone else can see you? Everyone has a part to play in the conversation. Interesting. Anyone else want to share their thoughts?
So we also dwell into the law enforcement side of the question. So do you have a right of privacy when you may be doing something that may be a risk to others? And at what point, what degree of damage justify what invasion of privacy?
So So the question was, from the law enforcement side, if you have a right to privacy even when you're doing something which might be damaging others, and balancing those two. Yeah. So interestingly, in the Talmud and in Jewish law in general, there isn't actually so much of a concept of right to privacy, or rights to very, very little. There's a much bigger focus on responsibility and less of a focus on rights. And that's very different than our discourse in America and in the world today, where human rights, that's the way we understand a lot of these issues. So the focus is more on responsibility. And in that setting, I think you're going to be much more quick to to execute justice on somebody who's up to no good, because they don't inherently have a right to privacy. They have the responsibility to not do bad things. And they have, other people have the responsibility not to violate their privacy. But if they're doing something which is wrong, I think there's going to be a quicker intervention. And now that may square, or that may feel philosophically, good, or that may say, we want to protect those rights. I'm not saying that's the correct way now. But the Talmud focuses on responsibilities much more than rights.
Thank you so much for coming, and
for
thank all of you for participating. I don't think when we first started talking about this talk, I had a full sense of the relevance of this to us in our everyday lives. Just even as practitioners of advertising, you wouldn't guess that we could learn something from ancient texts, and yet we can. So thank you. So many similarities. The Talmud even looked a little bit like a web page there.
It's the first hyperlinked text, because I even forgot to say that, but the Talmud links to each commentary is a link to that page or to something else, and it'll tell you, look this up in that book. And you're always, when you don't just read the Talmud straight linearly, you're always jumping around, linking from one book to another book.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's fun.
We'll put that in the archives for Google. That that was the first hyperlinked text. We always say, 1996 was the start, but clearly there was something before that. We learned a lot today about what it means to ask good questions, how we should think about plurality of voices, and making sure that every voice is heard and we can use tools like Havruta to do that. We probably need to do more of this inside our walls. And I think one of the things you said that really struck me is that this notion of loving the stranger is something that we need to embody in what we do every day. And maybe it has to do with policy and how we treat our users as well, and really think about who they are and how different they could be from us. And there's definitely something we need to learn about the issues we're facing every day around how we use and don't use machine learning, how we think about privacy, how we think about regulation, that we can look back in the ancient texts to figure out positioning on, and points of view that are meaningful and based in the wisdom of many generations. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.
And look, even you can study this, and it may sometimes give you the opposite answer or lead you in an opposite way that you might have thought. But the important thing is that you've engaged the questions. And the important thing is you've gone through the process of query and debate and refinement. And that's really what the Talmud is about. It's not about the answer. It's not about the destination. It's about the journey. It's the process, the learning, the encounter with the other, with the text, with the ancient tradition, with the modern world. Bring it all together in a conversation that we're all a part of. And a conversation that maybe doesn't give us the answers, but I think gives us a sense of comfort, knowing that we're part of something much greater, and that these questions are old questions that they couldn't quite figure out back then, but they thought about and they gave it their best shot, and we're doing the same thing today.
That is a great insight to help us move forward and conquer these big questions we have. Usually we end these talks, in Chicago at least, with one last question, some advice for the group of something you would recommend we either start doing, stop doing, or continue doing in order to take advantage of what you've taught us today around the ancient text wisdom that we can bring into our modern day.
Find a chavruta. Find a chavruta, call up somebody and say, I want to do this thing. I want to sit with you and just study this thing and yell at each other about it for an hour. Or find a chavruta in running or in yoga or in healthy eating, whatever it is, whatever you want to grow in, find a partner, do it with them, encounter the activity, encounter one another, and grow from it. That's my takeaway advice for everybody.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed this conversation, and we'll look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much.